TED Talks. Let me just say a little bit about TED Talks. There is now quite a lot of debate about whether TED Talks are a good thing or a bad thing, and they're very common. It is the current cultural form around the world that the lecture takes. Right? It's very interesting. Some people think the lecture is dead, but person next to me on the plane coming over spent like 10 hours, and you can spend a long time on the plane coming over, watching TED Talks. Like, who would have thought? The lecture is not dead, right? The TED Talk is alive and other variations on it. Do they do TED Talks in Singapore? Right? Sort of have these sort of TEDx events here. Do they do those? Yes? Yeah. It's pretty much a global phenomenon. So there's a few things here that I'll leave to you. Page 111 is by a guy who's done the most study about the structure of TED Talks, and his analysis is the classic TED Talk format is there on that chart in the different colors. So. And actually, Ken Robinson's talk really kind of fits this model, actually, if you think about it. We won't go into all the detail of that. There is something of that. If you're looking for a structure to give a talk around, that's probably a fairly good way to do it. But a few things about TED Talks. Why is it this phenomenon? Well, one is that they're short, right? There's usually an 18-minute limit. And what we know about people's attention spans is that 18 minutes is about as long as people can listen to something before they need to do something else, a different kind of mental activity. They need to talk to somebody, they need to write something down, they need to have a group discussion, they need to stand up and shake their limbs, whatever it is. 18 minutes is pretty reasonable. That time limit is actually getting shorter and shorter as culture is evolving. Our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. Back in the Puritan era, sermons were an hour and a half long, people, and no one complained about them. You find these things unimaginable these days, right? So 18 minutes. So there's something about that. And my hero in ministry, John Stott, said that every sermon, no matter how long it is, should feel like 20 minutes. So there is something about that. There's also something to this fact that it is largely spoken and not read, right? You notice he did not have a note. Most TED Talk speakers, as you've seen these things, do not actually have notes. What they're pressed by the organizers of TED is to memorize so that they can speak and that they're not actually watching a lot of notes. It makes it a more natural form of conversation rather than reading stuff. To read from notes is a deadly form of presentation, although an awful lot of lecture does it. TED Talks never do it. And there's a reason why TED Talks are more interesting than a lot of other things, because no one's reading from their notes. Another thing about TED Talks, not true of Ken Robinson, but it is generally true, is that they have very good visuals. Right? There's usually a big screen behind them, and usually they think very hard about what's on the screen. And what's on the screen is not a bunch of clutter. It's very carefully chosen. Some of them have, one or two words up there, and usually they have images. Right? Which leads me to the PowerPoint point, right? PowerPoint is potentially the worst thing in the world. And there are some slides here. Look at page 113. There's a little cartoon here that I wanted to show you. I need someone well versed in the art of torture. Do you know PowerPoint? A character with hooves and horns is sitting there. And then the next page, page 114, there's another cartoon that you might appreciate, as you can clearly see in slide 397, PowerPoint poisoning. The point about PowerPoint, just to stick with that for a moment, is less is more. Images are good, diagrams are good. That which assists the visual learner or depicts what you're talking about in a new and different kind of way. It's back to the point that we made earlier, which is to get at something really so it'll stick, go at it more than one particular way. Right? So if you have a very linear kind of verbal approach to explaining that sort of thing, then show it. right? Show it in some sort of schema or diagram. Show it in some sort of image. Illustrate it with some sort of person who demonstrates it, for instance, right? You can put all those on a screen very effectively. Right? The worst point here is what you've all seen, slide 397. Have you all been subjected to that sort of thing? Yes. You've all seen the print that's so small you can't hardly even read it. You're going like, what is up there, right? Page after page after page after page. Yes. Yes, we've all seen those. Thou shalt swear on a stack of Greenman notes. Thou shalt never do that to someone. Do not inflict PowerPoint death on anyone. Right? A few slides with a few words to capture keywords and remind people of what that is, but images, diagrams, ways of visually depicting stuff, that's helpful because it reinforces. It's back to that cone that we have with our friend Dale, right? Hearing is one thing, reading is another thing, seeing is another thing, doing is another thing, right? So that's all good. So I'm not completely anti it, but it's, again, kind of like lecture, it's often overused, right? And not used well, but like most things, it can be used well and not so well. That's my point. So point one, back to page 112, I've got an interesting little article that I use sometimes. Things that preachers can learn from TED Talks. A big idea approach and get your idea out. A time limit, collaboration, time on the visuals, practice, rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Stay away from notes, avoid jargon. And most of their talks do that actually if you pay attention. Draw people into caring. TED Talks are usually built around one big point and illustrations, right? The power of story is one of the things that TED has proven, right? Most of these really good TED Talks and the ones that have had an impact, the ones that have been used, the ones that are cited, have a huge amount of story in them. Huge amount of story. Why? Story well used, not just story for the sake of it, but story kind of the way Ken Robinson illustrates this, right? He's got a couple of stories and then a main story about Lillian, was that her name? Jillian. Jillian the dancer, right? Right? So there is power in the story because people connect at the level of story. And what does story do? Story connects the head and the heart. Story is always about the imagination. Right? There's power in that. So if you want this whole person transformation I'm talking about, there's immense power in stories. And I say that as someone who is not the natural storyteller. I am a natural philosopher. So I will give more abstract theoretical constructs just naturally. That's going to come first to my mind. Right? Then I'm going to have to think about, what's an example of that? How does that work? Who do I know that has illustrated this? Right? That's the way my mind works, right? Too much philosophy in my bloodstream. Got to drain some of that out a bit, right? So the power of story is one of those things, right? So there's much that's even TED could potentially teach. TED is itself, this, all things being equal, has to be said. The TED approach is also limited. There's only so much you can do in 18 minutes. They tend to be provocations or single point of contention that they want to make. There's often not necessarily all the argument to defend those things that you think should be there. There's value in the story. And story is a form of evidence for your claim, but story is not the only form of evidence for your claim. Right? You can be long on story and short on argument too, says the philosopher guy. So don't put all of your eggs in any one basket, but there are strengths in this, and it can be learned, but it's not good for all things because nothing is good for all things because you need a variety.